What if everything you thought about the final days of Queen Elizabeth II was wrong? What if the real cause of her rapid decline wasn't just age or health, but heartbreak? And what if the man who unknowingly broke her heart was the very same grandson she once called her joy and pride? Sounds impossible, right? But today, we pull back the curtain on a story so shocking, so deeply buried beneath royal silence and PR distractions, that many inside Buckingham Palace hoped it would never see daylight. A story that begins not with a scandal, but with a silence. A silence that started when Prince Harry turned his back on the very institution that raised him and ended with a king ready to erase him from royal history altogether. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because now, for the first time, we're going to reveal how King Charles III, in a series of cold, calculated moves, cut his youngest son out of the royal family, not out of spite, but out of sheer fury. Why? Because evidence, some of it emotional, some of it written, suggests that Prince Harry's very public rebellion may have played a role in hastening Queen Elizabeth's death. Let that sink in. We're not talking about conspiracy theories or gossip from tabloids. We're talking about documented correspondence, eyewitness reports from palace aides, first-hand accounts from those who stood just a few feet away as the Queen's spirit, once so indomitable, seemed to break under the weight of relentless personal attacks coming from the inside, from her own family, specifically from the very man she once hoped would bridge the gap between tradition and modernity. Prince Harry, the spare, who became a threat. Now, before you rush to assumptions, this isn't about villainizing one man or canonizing another. This expose isn't black and white. It's gray, very gray, full of contradiction, heartbreak, and yes, rage. But it's a story that must be told. Because what began as a rift between father and son has now become a full-blown royal purge. And the timing? Well, that's no accident either. The Queen's death was followed by a wave of global mourning. Her son ascended the throne. The nation, grieving, rallied around its new monarch. But in the background, something darker was brewing. Quiet meetings, legal consultations, strategic media leaks. Behind the gilded doors of Clarence House in Windsor, King Charles wasn't just grieving his mother. He was preparing for war with his own son. And make no mistake, this war isn't fought with swords or speeches. It's fought with erasure, banishment, total royal isolation. So why now? Why is King Charles pulling the trigger on his coldest move yet, severing Harry once and for all? Because of a discovery made at Balmoral. A single document, buried in the Queen's personal writing desk. A letter, reportedly written in her own hand, dated just weeks before her final appearance on the Buckingham Palace balcony. A letter addressed not to the public, not to Parliament, but to Charles. And the contents? We'll get to that soon. But just know this. Once Charles read that letter, everything changed. His grief hardened, his patience shattered, and whatever small hope there was for reconciliation died on the spot. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. To understand how we got here, we need to rewind. Not to the funeral, not to the coronation, but to the precise moment Queen Elizabeth's emotional strength began to fracture. Not from age, but from betrayal. From her grandson's shocking choices and the emotional avalanche they triggered. Let's talk about the day the Queen reportedly broke down in private, shortly after the Oprah interview. A day when staff say she stood at the window of Windsor Castle, unmoving, tea gone cold, eyes locked on the horizon as if searching for something she'd lost. That was the day, many believe, everything shifted. Now ask yourself, could one interview do that? Not likely. But what if that interview was just the tip of the iceberg? What if it was followed by documentaries, book deals, private recordings, accusations of racism, threats of more revelations, and a total rejection of royal duty, all while the Queen was fighting her own silent battle with declining health? Would you survive that kind of heartbreak at 96? Would your heart keep beating through betrayal after betrayal? This is where the facts get chilling. Because behind the public image of the Queen, the brightly colored coats, the gentle smile, the poised wave, was a woman deeply wounded by family disintegration. A woman who watched, in real time, as her grandson scorched the legacy she'd spent 70 years building. And yes, she was a monarch, but she was also a mother, a grandmother, a human being. And like anyone, there's only so much pain a person can absorb before something inside them breaks. Now let's pivot. Because while Elizabeth was trying to hold the crown together, Charles was watching something very different unfold. His son, once the beloved party prince, had become an international wild card. Every interview, every appearance, every podcast dropped a new bombshell. And Charles, already under enormous pressure to manage succession, found himself cornered. Do you protect the monarchy, or do you protect your son? Charles chose the former. And once the Queen passed, he made it his mission to ensure Harry never had the chance to destroy what remained. But here's where things get even darker. Because in Charles's eyes, this wasn't just about family drama. This was about accountability, retribution, a message to the world. And to Harry, that actions have consequences. And those consequences? They started quietly. Harry's name disappearing from internal palace documents. Security arrangements reviewed. Frogmore keys reclaimed. Titles subtly erased from briefings and bulletins. And then came the meetings, private ones, between Charles, Camilla, and the senior courtiers. And that's when a name came up, the letter. Yes, the one found at Balmoral. The one that may just hold the emotional smoking gun that links Harry's campaign to the Queen's rapid decline. Now at this point, you're probably asking, what did the letter say? Why hasn't the public seen it? Why did Charles act with such cold precision after reading it? We'll get to that, because in Chapter 2, we reveal what palace insiders claim was in that document, and how it shattered the king's final shred of hope for Harry. But before we go there, one last thought. This exposé isn't about taking sides. It's about asking the hard questions. What price do we pay for truth? What happens when personal pain clashes with public image? And in the end, was Harry a reckless rebel, or a misunderstood victim of a centuries-old system designed to chew people up and spit them out? We may never know for certain, but what we do know is this. Something happened in those final months that forever changed how King Charles saw his son. And once you hear what came next, you might never see this family, or the crown, the same way again. Because as we're about to reveal, Charles didn't just cut Harry off. He destroyed him. And it all started with that letter. But what exactly did it say? And who leaked it to Charles before the Queen even passed? That is where our story truly begins. What breaks a monarch? Is it age, illness, politics, or is it something far more personal, something invisible, quiet, and cruel? Because the Queen, the woman who met with presidents and prime ministers, who held the Commonwealth together for over 70 years, was not brought to her knees by war or scandal. She was broken by family. And not just any family. Her grandson. And it happened, according to those closest to her, in one single, chilling moment. A morning that should have been just another peaceful routine inside Windsor Castle. But instead, it changed everything. Let's go there. Picture this. It's spring 2021. The daffodils are blooming across the Windsor grounds, and inside, the Queen begins her day exactly as she had for decades. Waking early, breakfast on a silver tray, a quiet moment with her beloved corgis, and her red boxes of paperwork, stacked neatly, waiting for her review. But that morning, something was off. Staff noticed it immediately. The teacup on her tray? Untouched. The signature navy blue Launer handbag? Still sitting by the door. And the Queen? Standing alone at the east-facing window, unmoving. Eyes locked on the misty horizon. A stillness so heavy, it frightened even the most seasoned aides. They'd seen her grieve. They'd seen her scold. But they had never seen her like this. And they would later say, that was the morning she stopped pretending. But what had happened? The night before, the Oprah interview had aired in full. 2 hours of raw, emotional accusations from Harry and Meghan that rippled across the globe like a tsunami. Claims of racism, of silence, of abandonment, of being trapped in the very system the Queen had devoted her life to upholding. The monarchy wasn't just criticized, it was put on trial. And in millions of living rooms, worldwide, the verdict was damning. But for Elizabeth, this wasn't about headlines. This was about Harry, her grandson, the boy who once sprinted down palace corridors with untied shoelaces and grass stains on his knees. The child who made her laugh with corgi impressions and who held her hand during trooping the color. And now this? He had gone on international television, side by side with Meghan, and accused her institution, her family, of racism, cruelty, and abandonment. And even worse, he had done it without warning. No letter, no call, no warning shot, just silence, then betrayal. Now pause for a second and ask yourself, how would you feel? Imagine a loved one going on national television and describing you as part of a system that destroyed them. Imagine watching it from your own living room, alone, while the rest of the world eats popcorn and shares hashtags. Wouldn't it break you? Wouldn't you wonder, what did I do so wrong? For the Queen, that morning at Windsor was reportedly the first time in her reign she refused to sign anything in her red box. Staff say she waved it away with a whisper. Not now, please. Not today. Unprecedented. Her private secretary, Sir Edward Young, was so alarmed he reportedly contacted Charles immediately. And Charles? Furious. Because not only had his son gone nuclear on the family, but now his mother, the monarch, was shaken, pale, and clearly distressed. But it didn't stop there. Within hours, the press was in overdrive. Every outlet from the BBC to CNN was dissecting the Oprah interview. Palace aides were scrambling. Crisis teams formed. Camilla remained silent, icy. William? Seething. And stony. And in the middle of it all, Elizabeth. Now, some defenders say she wasn't upset by the claims, but by the circumstance. That she knew the crown had flaws. That she had weathered far worse. But according to those closest to her, this wasn't about politics. It was personal. Because for the Queen, Harry represented something no one else could, Diana's legacy. She had promised to watch over him, to protect the boys, to hold the family together after that tragic tunnel in Paris. And now, Harry had thrown it all away, gone rogue, chosen drama over duty. And in doing so, he had chosen to break her heart. But here's the twist. This wasn't the first time Harry had disappointed her. There had been signs, whispers, tensions building ever since Megxit in early 2020. But the Oprah interview was the detonation. And that morning, inside Windsor Castle, as the Queen stood by the window, what no one realized was that she had already begun to say goodbye. Not to the world, not to the throne, but to him. From that day forward, aides noticed a marked change. Her routines became looser. She took longer walks. Alone, she asked fewer questions during briefings. And, perhaps most heartbreakingly, she stopped asking how Harry was. One palace aide reportedly remarked, before, she would ask if Harry had written, if he had called, if he was all right. After that day, she stopped. And it wasn't bitterness. It was grief. Deep, private grief. A wound that no title could mend. Let's pause again, because here's where things get more complex. Was the Queen simply too old to absorb this emotional blow? Or did this public shaming by Harry and Meghan actually accelerate her decline? According to several sources, her health took a sharp downward turn in the months following that interview. Fatigue, loss of appetite, moments of confusion. Doctors attributed it to the toll of age. But others weren't so sure. One source, a longtime Windsor staffer, confided. She was tired. But more than that, she seemed empty. Like the joy had gone out of her. Think about that. A woman who'd met with Churchill, Kennedy, Mandela, now undone by a grandson's talk show confessional. But this isn't a story about a broken queen. It's a story about what happened next. Because while the Queen retreated into quiet sorrow, Charles was gearing up for something far more forceful. He didn't see the Oprah interview as a cry for help. He saw it as a calculated strike, an act of aggression. And in his eyes, it had wounded the monarchy and his mother irreparably. So he made a decision. He would protect the crown, even if it meant cutting off his own son. And when you hear what he did next, it will chill you to the bone. Because while the world focused on public statements and press releases, behind the scenes, Charles began building a case. A private investigation. A timeline of betrayals. Emails. Messages. Witnesses. But one piece of that puzzle was still missing. The Queen's own words. And weeks later, in a quiet moment at Balmoral, that piece surfaced. A letter. Handwritten. Tucked into her personal writing desk. A letter addressed to Charles. One that confirmed everything he feared. And once he read it, the war against Harry began in earnest. But what exactly did it say? Who gave Charles access to it before the Queen even passed? And why did it change his view of Harry forever? That is what we'll reveal in Chapter 2. Because in the next section, you'll hear what palace insiders claim was written in the Queen's final warning. and how it triggered the most ruthless royal revenge in modern history. Get ready, because the contents of that letter will shock you. And what came after, no one saw coming. What if the most powerful man in the monarchy wasn't the king, but the ghost of a queen who left behind one final command? What if a single sheet of handwritten paper, hidden away in a drawer at Balmoral Castle, carried enough emotional weight to justify a royal purge? And what if that paper wasn't meant to be found until after her death? Let's talk about the letter. The letter that palace aides now refer to only in whispers. The one that wasn't in the official archive. Wasn't meant for biographers. Wasn't supposed to be seen by anyone except one man, Charles. Now, to understand the impact of this letter, you need to understand where it was found and why that matters. Let's go to Balmoral, the Queen's beloved retreat in Scotland. Not just a royal estate, but her sanctuary, her hideaway, the place where Elizabeth Windsor, not the crown, could breathe. It was here that she spent the last quiet weeks of her life. And it was here, shortly after her death, that palace staff began the somber process of sorting her personal belongings. Among the corgi photos, tartan shawls, and stacks of private correspondence, a desk drawer was found locked. Not unusual. The Queen was known for her love of order and secrets. But what was unusual was what happened next. That drawer wasn't opened by a staffer. It was opened by Charles. He had flown to Balmoral within hours of her passing. Not for ceremony. Not even for mourning. But for closure. And according to multiple insiders, it was during that first night, alone, with only a single footman on duty, that he unlocked the drawer. And there it was. A small envelope. Cream-colored. Slightly yellowed at the edges. On the front, in her unmistakable handwriting, just 2 words. To Charles. Nothing else. No seal. No date. Just a private letter from mother to son. He opened it. And whatever he read inside, it changed him. Because sources say that when he emerged from that room hours later, he was pale, cold, and silent. He didn't speak to Camilla. He didn't brief his advisors. He walked outside, stood under the black Scottish sky, and stared out at the hills. The next morning, the war began. But what did the letter say? Officially, we're not supposed to know. But in the months since that night, fragments have leaked. Not in headlines, not in tabloids, but through carefully placed whispers. Passed along by those who served the Queen and watched Charles's transformation with growing unease. And those fragments? They tell a devastating story. According to one Balmoral aide, the letter was written just days after the Platinum Jubilee. The Queen, exhausted from public appearances, had returned to Balmoral for rest. But rest, it seems, didn't come. Because during those quiet nights, she reportedly dictated a series of personal reflections. Letters. One for William, one for Anne, and one for Charles. But Charles's letter wasn't just reflective. It was a warning about Harry. Now pause there for a moment. Let that sink in. The Queen, stoic, famously tight-lipped, felt the need to put in writing her thoughts about her grandson. And what she wrote, according to insiders, was this. My heart is troubled by his choices. The boy I knew is lost in noise. I do not recognize the man he has become. Those words alone would devastate any parent. But that wasn't all. The letter reportedly included a list, a timeline, of incidents that had hurt her. Not politically, personally. The Oprah interview. The unauthorized biography quotes. The Netflix production staff spotted near Windsor. But most damaging, a final phone call. One she described in the letter as cold, rehearsed, and entirely without love. We believe this was the last direct conversation between Harry and the Queen, weeks before her Jubilee appearance. A call meant to reconcile. But it had the opposite effect. According to the letter, she wrote, I felt as though I were being handled. Not spoken to, but managed. Like a figure in a script. That line reportedly broke Charles. Because it painted a picture not of family, but of performance. Of Harry speaking not from the heart, but from a PR strategy. Now here's where the contradiction cuts deepest. Was Harry trying to protect his family? Or had he truly turned? Was he acting from trauma? Or ambition? We don't know. But Charles made up his mind that night. Because the letter didn't end with just sadness. It ended with instruction. A sentence that, according to sources, sealed Harry's fate. You must do what I could not. Protect the crown from within and from without. In royal terms, that's code. Code for containment. Separation. even banishment. And for Charles, it was permission. Permission to act. Permission to protect the institution, even at the cost of his own blood. But let's go deeper. Because here's what makes this letter so volatile. It wasn't supposed to be seen yet. Multiple royal experts believe the Queen intended for Charles to read it after her death, a final word from beyond the grave. But somehow, whether through grief or suspicion, Charles opened it early. And once he did, there was no going back. Because the letter didn't just validate his fears. It gave him a weapon, a moral shield. He could now say, if only to himself, that his actions weren't cruel. They were royal duty. And over the next few weeks, that's exactly how he operated. Cold, precise, unapologetic, Frogmore revoked, titles scrubbed from internal comms, security updates fast-tracked, media briefings rewritten to exclude any mention of the Duke of Sussex. And Harry? He had no idea. Not yet. Because to the public, everything seemed normal, respectful, mournful. But behind the scenes, Charles had gone full scorched earth. And when his advisors asked why, he gave no answer. He didn't need to, because he had the letter. Now ask yourself, why hasn't this been revealed until now? Why hasn't anyone seen the actual document? Because, according to insiders, Charles burned it. Not out of shame, but out of resolve. He didn't want it politicized, weaponized, leaked. It was, in his words, for me alone. But the memory of that letter, the instructions it carried, that lives on. And it's shaped every move Charles has made since becoming king. Now here's the twist. Not everyone agreed. Camilla reportedly advised caution and advised silence. But Charles? He had made up his mind. And that leads us to the next chapter in this royal unraveling. What Harry did next. Because when news reached him, quietly, through palace channels, that things were shifting behind the scenes, he made a decision of his own. One that would ensure any remaining bridges burned to ash. And it all started with a phone call. One final, desperate attempt to reclaim his place. And what came of it would send shockwaves through Windsor. But that's a story for the next chapter. Because what Harry said on that call, and who answered, would set off a chain reaction that no one in the royal family was prepared for. Not even Charles. How does a prince become a pariah? How does the once cheeky, spare, beloved by crowds, adored by his grandmother, feared by no one, turn into the most dangerous voice against the very monarchy that gave him everything? It didn't happen overnight. No, Harry's transformation wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow ignition, flickers of rebellion that grew into wildfire. And what started as a quiet exit evolved into a scorched earth campaign. Because after reading the Queen's final letter, Charles went into lockdown mode. But Harry? Harry went on the offensive. And what triggered it? A phone call. Let's rewind to the days after the Queen's funeral. Grief was in the air. Black suits, bowed heads, carefully choreographed silence. The firm was united, for show. But behind the scenes, things were fraying fast. Harry had been deliberately placed on the sidelines, literally and symbolically. No military uniform. No public mention in the King's first speech. No solo moments of remembrance. Even the positioning at Westminster Abbey told a story. He was there, but barely. And he felt it. Sources close to the Sussex camp say that Harry, already emotionally raw, was blindsided by the iciness of the royal machine during that week. And that's when he picked up the phone. He didn't call Charles. He called William, the brother who had once been his best man, his co-conspirator, his shield against the cold machinery of the crown, the man who now wouldn't meet his eyes across the chapel. And what did Harry say? According to leaked fragments from a memoir draft, the call started civil, awkward, grief-laden, but it didn't stay that way. Because Harry wasn't just calling to mourn. He was calling to warn. He told William that if the palace continued to sideline him and Meghan, if their voices continued to be erased, then the truth will come out whether they like it or not. And William's response? Reportedly, just one word. Don't. Don't what? Don't threaten. Don't escalate. Don't assume you're safe from the consequences. That was the subtext. Because by this point, William had seen the letter too. And while he didn't agree with everything Charles was planning, he understood why it was happening. To William, Harry had already crossed the line. And now? Now he was standing on a cliff, threatening to jump and drag the whole institution down with him. But Harry didn't see it that way. To Harry, he was defending his family, his new family. Meghan, Archie, Lilibet, He believed they had been wronged, vilified, silenced. And if the palace wouldn't listen quietly, then he'd make them listen publicly. And so began the campaign. It started with strategic leaks. First to Omid Scobie, always the unofficial mouthpiece. Then to U.S. journalists. Then to Meghan's old Hollywood contacts. Stories began to surface. Meghan's miscarried call for help. Archie's skin color concerns. Secret tears at fittings. Palace aide's so-called cruelty. And in the background, Netflix, cameras, production teams. Because here's the part many forget. Even as the Queen was laying in state, the Sussex's media machine was already in motion. They had been filming, quietly, discreetly, for months. And now that Charles had iced them out, the gloves came off. Harry leaned in hard to the narrative. No longer the lost royal. Now the victim-turned-truth-teller. The documentary was edited fast. Brutally. Scenes were reshuffled. Footage from the funeral was requested, then denied. But the plan was clear. Harry wasn't just stepping away. He was burning bridges on the way out. And the book? Oh, the book. Spare. What was once meant to be a reflective memoir became a battering ram. Ghost-written with intensity, it spared no one. Charles was painted as aloof. Camilla as cunning. William as explosive. Even Kate was implicated, cold, distant, unsympathetic. But the most devastating pages? The ones about the Queen. Because here's where Harry shocked even his own team. Despite pressure to avoid criticism of his grandmother, Harry included a section where he described her as surrounded by handlers, deeply institutionalized, and unable to protect those she loved. He stopped short of direct blame. But the implication? The Queen was a prisoner of the crown, and Harry had escaped it. That line, a direct insult to Charles's vision of monarchy. Because for Charles, the crown wasn't a prison. It was a calling. And now his son was calling it a cage. But wait. It gets worse. Around this time, private audio leaked to a documentary producer. Harry, in what he thought was an off-camera moment, allegedly said, "If they think they can freeze us out, we'll make more noise. They've underestimated what we know." That clip never aired, but it did the rounds behind closed doors. And when Charles heard it, he exploded. Because now, Harry wasn't just disillusioned. He was dangerous. Dangerous because he knew the inside language. Dangerous because he had the public's sympathy. Dangerous because he no longer had anything to lose. Now let's pause and ask the question. Why didn't anyone stop him? Why didn't Charles pick up the phone? Because by then, it was too late. Charles had already made his decision. The Queen's letter had hardened him. Harry's leaks had confirmed it. There would be no reunion, no forgiveness, only consequences, and they would come swiftly. Because what Harry didn't know at that moment was that Charles had already instructed the Privy Council to begin reviewing titles. That behind the walls of Clarence House, legal teams were quietly consulting on the letter's patent, an obscure constitutional tool that could redefine who was and wasn't royal. And once Charles found out about the Netflix clause, a stipulation in Meghan's contract that required maximum editorial independence and unfettered access to Sussex commentary. That was the final straw. The bridge was gone. Ashes. But Harry? He didn't stop. He leaned in harder. Podcast interviews. Mental health panels. Award show speeches. "Meghan saved me," he said. And every time he spoke, the monarchy flinched. Even those sympathetic to him began to worry. Not because he wasn't telling his truth, but because of what he was willing to risk to do it. His family, his titles, his future, and now, even his past. Because in the next chapter, we'll reveal how Harry's own memories, recorded in private therapy sessions and later shared with his ghostwriter, became the basis for his most brutal claims. And how one of those memories, a distorted recollection of a childhood moment with Charles, triggered a secret palace investigation that would lead to an even more chilling discovery. A discovery that had nothing to do with Meghan, and everything to do with Harry's view of his father. Get ready. Because the next revelation doesn't just shake the monarchy. It calls into question whether Harry ever truly escaped his royal past, or if he's still, in some twisted way, trying to tear it down, piece by piece. What do you say to a monarch when the cameras are off, the public is mourning, and the family is broken? Do you offer comfort? An apology? Or do you, knowingly or not, plant the final dagger? This is the story of that call, the last known personal conversation between Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Harry. A call that insiders say was meant to heal wounds, but instead deepened them forever. A call that ended not with forgiveness, but with a quiet, devastating goodbye. Let's rewind. It's late summer 2022. The Queen is in Balmoral. Fragile, thin, but still mentally sharp. Behind her smile are layers of grief. The death of her beloved Philip, the pressures of transitioning the crown to Charles, and Harry's continued media offensive from across the Atlantic. Every new headline stings. Every interview is a ghost of another wound. But then something unexpected happens. Harry reaches out. He wants to speak to the Queen alone. No advisors. No courtiers. No Charles. No Camilla. The Queen agrees. At this point, she's still hoping for reconciliation. Still believes, perhaps naively, that family can find its way back to each other. But what follows isn't what she expected. The call, made via encrypted palace line, is described as chillingly polite. According to two insiders who were briefed immediately afterward, the Queen's demeanor shifted midway through. She had been warm at the start, quietly hopeful, but then Harry began to speak in a tone she found odd, scripted, distant. Some say Meghan was in the room with him. Some say she wasn't. What we do know is that the Queen felt he was reading from something. She later described the call to a confidant as shaped like a press release. Let that settle in. Imagine being 96 years old, sitting alone in a castle filled with memories and silence, hoping to hear the voice of a grandson you raised like a second son, only to hear rehearsed lines, PR positioning, cold formality. What did Harry say? The palace has never released a transcript, but portions have reportedly leaked among senior courtiers. According to those fragments, Harry expressed the following points: that he and Meghan wished to reset the relationship with the crown, that the family must acknowledge past harms to ensure future harmony, that moving forward, the Sussexes would speak their truth regardless of institutional discomfort, and finally, that the Queen's continued silence on critical matters of race and media bias had been personally painful. That last line, it landed like a thunderclap, because in Harry's mind, it was truth-telling. But to the Queen, it was betrayal, not because she didn't care about justice, but because in that moment, her grandson wasn't speaking to her as family. He was speaking as a brand, a global figure, a corporate entity, an influencer with a platform and an agenda. And she knew, instantly, that she had lost him. Not just physically, emotionally, completely. There's a silence that followed that call which insiders say lasted almost a full minute. No words, just breathing. And then, according to one aide, the Queen whispered, "Very well, I understand. Not, I love you. Not, let's talk again soon. Just, I understand." And the call ended. Now ask yourself, what was really said in those seconds of silence? Was it grief? Resignation? A grandmother realizing that the boy who once called her gone no longer saw her as anything but a symbol? We may never know. But what we do know is that from that moment on, the Queen never spoke to Harry again. Not directly. Not on Zoom. Not through letters. And that's not speculation. Multiple staffers confirm that after that call, every subsequent communication with Harry went through intermediaries. And Queen Elizabeth? She quietly instructed her personal secretary to file that call in the sensitive archive, a designation typically reserved for affairs of state, not family. That should tell you everything. Because what many don't realize is that the monarchy doesn't collapse from scandal, it collapses from within, from broken trust. And this call? It broke that trust permanently. But here's where it gets even darker. Because while Harry may have thought he was being clear, honest, brave, Charles saw it differently. When he was later briefed about the tone and content of the conversation, he was livid. Not at the Queen. At Harry. He reportedly asked, "Who talks to their grandmother like that, let alone the Queen?" Camilla, ever the strategist, said nothing, but reportedly advised Charles that this was the moment to act, not react. And act he did. In the weeks following the call, the following decisions were made inside Clarence's house. Harry and Meghan would no longer be considered working royals in any capacity, ceremonial or honorary. Their names would be quietly removed from the order of precedence documents. The Crown would no longer publicly respond to Sussex-related media stories. Silence would be the new strategy. And finally, Charles would begin formal proceedings to review the use of titles, including Duke of Sussex. This wasn't just fallout. This was the beginning of erasure. Now, to the public, nothing changed right away. But behind the scenes, everything shifted. The Queen, once Harry's protector, had withdrawn. And Charles? He had hardened. In his eyes, the call had confirmed everything in the Balmoral letter, and worse. Because now, he didn't just see Harry as hurt. He saw him as hostile, a liability, an outsider, a man no longer tethered to the family, but floating above it with a global microphone and $1 million contract. And so the king did what kings do. He started closing doors, politely, permanently. And as we'll see in the next chapter, those closed doors didn't just shut Harry out. They would open up a series of revelations that would finally pull Camilla into the center of the storm. Because while Charles was busy protecting the crown, Camilla was plotting revenge. And her role in the next phase of Harry's downfall is more explosive than anyone ever imagined. Because what Camilla did next would make even Charles flinch, and would push Harry into making his most reckless move yet. When you think of the cold power behind the throne, your mind might go to Elizabeth I's counselors or the scheming advisors of medieval kings. But in today's royal family, that shadowy influence doesn't come from a politician, a strategist, or even a palisade. It comes from the queen consort herself, Camilla, once scorned by the public, then rehabilitated by the media. Now, quietly, the most feared figure behind King Charles's throne. Because what happened after Harry's final call with the Queen didn't just trigger Charles to draw the line. It awakened something far more dangerous. Camilla's rage. Let's rewind. To understand the true depth of Camilla's fury, we have to remember the context. For years, she had played the long game. From being labeled the other woman, to slowly transforming herself into a maternal, humorous, softly spoken presence within the royal fold. She endured decades of tabloid smears, whisper campaigns, cold stares. She never fought back. She simply endured. And that's why the Sussexes' attacks hit differently. They weren't just critiques of the institution. They were personal. In Harry's interviews and in his book Spare, he referred to Camilla as dangerous, calculating, and a villain who needed to rehabilitate her image at any cost. He accused her of trading stories to the press to secure her own status. He even implied that she fed Charles selective information to drive a wedge between the brothers. Now think about this. Camilla had spent nearly 2 decades rebuilding her reputation. Slowly, carefully. She had never responded publicly to Diana's legacy. She had stayed in the background. She had done the work. And now, Harry was ripping it all down with a few sentences and a smirk. It wasn't just offensive. It was war. And Camilla, queen consort or not, was done playing nice. Insiders say her fury was quiet at first. Icy silence. A tightening of the jaw. No response when Harry's name was mentioned during meetings. But then, something snapped. It happened, reportedly, after an emergency crisis meeting at Clarence House. The topic? The Netflix docuseries. An early cut had been leaked to senior aides, and within it, there were scenes that portrayed Camilla as a scheming social climber. One shot even showing her image next to a newspaper headline calling her Britain's most hated woman. The editorial framing? Clear. Meghan equals victim. Harry equals rebel. Camilla equals villain. And that's when Camilla made her move. According to 3 separate sources, she told Charles, firmly, directly, and without hesitation. Either he goes, or I do. It was an ultimatum. A raw demand from the one person Charles couldn't ignore. Now ask yourself, how powerful does someone have to be to issue that kind of threat to a king? And not just any king. A man who had waited his entire life for the throne, and who had sacrificed everything, including public opinion, for this woman. And yet, she said it. No more Harry. No more waiting. End it. Or lose me. At first, Charles hesitated. He reportedly told her, he's still my son. To which Camilla replied, he's not acting like one. And she wasn't wrong. Because behind the scenes, Harry was gearing up for even more exposure. Another interview with Oprah was rumored. A Netflix follow-up focused on Meghan's transition into royalty. Leaks about childhood trauma. A chapter that was allegedly cut from Spare about Charles's tearful outbursts during Diana's funeral. In short, the Sussex machine was still running. And Camilla had had enough. But here's where things get even more explosive. Camilla didn't just pressure Charles. She acted. According to one insider, she activated what palisades refer to as the Red File, a private dossier compiled by royal communications staff on the Sussexes' post-royal activities. This wasn't just gossip. It included internal notes from royal press officers who had been contacted by Netflix producers, unpublished photos of Harry and Meghan taken near restricted royal residences, a timeline of all commercial engagements that referenced their royal titles, and, most damningly, a series of private messages between Meghan's team and a UK tabloid editor that appeared to show coordination on anti-Camilla narratives. That last piece? It was nuclear, because if proven, it meant the Sussexes, or their proxies, were feeding stories to the very press they claimed had abused them. And Camilla? She presented it all to Charles, not with emotion, with evidence. And her message was clear. This isn't just about family. It's about control. If you let them keep this up, they will rewrite history while we sit in silence. That line reportedly shook Charles. He wasn't a fool. He had seen how fast public narratives could turn. The Queen had barely been buried, and already Harry's interviews were framing her as complicit in Meghan's pain. Charles was next, unless he did something. So he did. At a private meeting in early December, Charles summoned his most senior legal advisors. Camilla was not present. Neither was William. Just the king, his Lord Chamberlain, and his most trusted constitutional lawyer. The order? Review the letters patent. Not just regarding the Duke and Duchess of Sussex titles, but regarding all styles and privileges associated with Harry. What did that mean? It meant revoking the HRH status in all formal capacities, removing Harry from the official line of duty rotation, erasing his coat of arms from royal charitable publications, and, most symbolically, banning the use of Royal Highness on any future commercial product tied to the Sussex name. This wasn't just distancing. It was deletion. And Charles, for the first time, didn't flinch. He had finally crossed the emotional threshold. Not because of the Queen's letter, not because of Harry's words, but because of Camilla's fury and her proof. Now here's where things take a brutal turn. The palace didn't announce these changes. They simply enacted them. Quietly, subtly, but deliberately. Harry's name disappeared from official correspondence. His picture was moved in the Buckingham Palace gallery. His title stopped appearing in press briefings. And behind closed doors, he was referred to only as the Duke. Never Prince. Never His Royal Highness. It was as if he had become a ghost. And when Harry learned of these changes, he was furious. He saw it not as consequence, but as betrayal. Sources close to him say, he told Meghan, "They're trying to erase me. They're actually doing it." And that's when Harry made the single most reckless decision of his campaign. He gave the green light on the next documentary installment, an unfiltered look at life after the Queen, with new footage, new interviews, and one segment dedicated entirely to Camilla. The working title? The Real Crown. But what Harry didn't know was that this time, the palace had a counterattack already in motion, and it would strike at the very heart of his credibility. Because just as the Sussexes were about to launch their most aggressive media assault yet, a secret Charles had been sitting on would finally be revealed. A discovery found not in Balmoral, not in Windsor, but in the Queen's private correspondence archive. A truth that would shock even Harry's most loyal supporters. And what was in that discovery? Let's just say, it rewrites everything we thought we knew about who was really pulling the strings, and what the Queen actually feared in her final days. What if everything you thought about royal control, the PR spin, the carefully worded statements, the calm faces behind chaos, wasn't directed by a king or even a queen? What if, in the final months of her life, Queen Elizabeth II began documenting a trail of betrayal so deep, so devastating, she couldn't trust anyone but her pen to hold it? Because there's something the public has never been told. Not about the press wars, not about the Megxit negotiations, not even about the Netflix docuseries. This is about a dossier, compiled in secret, filed away, untouched, until King Charles found it. And what was inside didn't just confirm the Queen's deepest suspicions. It revealed the precise machinery of how her grandson and his wife systematically dismantled the royal firewall from the outside in. Let's go there. The story begins just a few weeks before the Queen's passing. Her health was declining, yes, but her mind? Sharp as ever. She had long relied on routine, Morning papers, daily correspondence, private audiences. But as the scandals intensified, something in her shifted. According to palace insiders, the Queen began asking unusual questions. Who approved that press briefing? Why wasn't I shown this draft before it went out? Why are American photographers outside the estate line? To most, it seemed like minor worry. But to the Queen, it was surveillance, disloyalty, exposure. And so she began writing things down, not just in letters, in a personal black leather notebook kept in a locked drawer at Windsor. This wasn't a diary. It was a log, detailed, sharp, chronological, dates, names, incidents. Some entries were just a few lines. Others spanned pages. The Queen, the woman famous for never complaining, never explaining, had finally decided to explain to herself. Now pause, because what Charles found weeks later was not just his mother's grief. It was her investigation, and it had a name, stamped on the front of the folder. Dossier H. As in Harry. Inside, dozens of pages of printed documents, handwritten annotations, attached emails, and the Queen's own reflections on everything that had unfolded since Harry and Meghan's departure from royal duties. But here's the part that stunned Charles. Many of these documents he had never seen. They had bypassed his office, directly sent to the Queen from private sources. Journalists, diplomats, trusted royal staff who didn't trust the palace's internal system anymore. One note from a retired Commonwealth ambassador read, "Your Majesty, I forward this with deep respect. It appears the Duke and Duchess have engaged media consultants in the U.S. to position themselves as royal reformers. Their strategy relies heavily on portraying the monarchy as out of touch and racially insensitive." Attached, a pitch deck, real, professional, from a Beverly Hills firm, labeled Brand Sussex 2025, Redefining Royal Legacy for a Global Audience. Inside were campaign goals, a messaging blueprint, potential Netflix themes, and key talking points. Among them, the Queen represents legacy. We represent the future. Make Diana's story a symbol of royal rebirth. Focus on family versus institution. Harry is the bridge. Recast Meghan's journey as modern grace under fire. It read like a war plan. And for the Queen, it was devastating. Charles turned the page. There were transcripts of podcast pre-interviews, some anonymous, some verified, where producers discussed how to soften but not remove the accusation of institutional racism. Even more disturbing, a string of texts forwarded from a trusted aide at Kensington Palace, showing Harry's former assistant trying to secure a speaking engagement at a Silicon Valley conference. One message read, "We want to position the Duke as a leadership figure for men reimagining masculinity post-monarchy." And the most damning file? A private email chain between Netflix producers and a Sussex communications rep, dated just 6 weeks before the Queen's Jubilee. Subject line, Queen appearance. Can we frame it as symbolic closure? One producer wrote, "This could be her final public appearance. Great for episode pacing if we position it as passing the torch, even if we don't say it outright." That line, even if we don't say it outright, it was manipulation, narrative control, emotional exploitation. And the Queen had read every word. She had circled that line in red ink. Next to it, she wrote, "They are scripting my legacy." Charles was speechless, because this wasn't a miscommunication. This wasn't Harry lashing out in grief. This was strategy, and it confirmed everything the Queen had feared, that her final year had been turned into a season finale, that her jubilee, her silence, her pain, had been storyboard for streaming content, that she had been used by her own grandson. The last few pages of the dossier were the most haunting. Her handwriting became more emotional, more personal. She wrote, "I raised him as best I could, but he no longer sees me. He sees only a symbol, a system, a villain in a narrative that flatters his truth." And then, at the bottom of the page, "God help us if this becomes the new royal standard." Let that sink in. A monarch, arguably the most experienced stateswoman of the 20th and 21st centuries, reduced to a side character in a Netflix saga. Charles closed the folder, and for the first time, reportedly wept. He realized that he hadn't just lost his mother. He had lost the last thread connecting Harry to the royal family's soul. The Queen had been that thread, and now she was gone. And in her place, a media war with no rules. But Charles wasn't just devastated. He was furious. Because up until that moment, part of him still believed this could be fixed. But now he knew. This wasn't just rebellion. It was rebranding, and it had to be stopped. The next morning, Charles summoned his chief advisors. He placed the dossier on the table. He said just one word: prepare. And that word would set off a chain reaction inside the palace unlike anything since Diana's death. Because what came next wouldn't be a press statement. It wouldn't be a stern letter. It would be a royal purge. But not everyone was on board. Because even within the family, there were whispers. Was Charles going too far? And in the next chapter, we'll see how that growing tension inside the palace, between protection and overreaction, led to one of the most carefully orchestrated acts of erasure in royal history. A removal so quiet, so ruthless. Harry wouldn't even learn about it until the news hit the front page. What happens when you stop being family and start becoming content? When palace doors close, but streaming cameras keep rolling. This is the chapter where the glossy world of Hollywood collided, violently, with the last emotional tether between a grandmother and her grandson. And at the center of it all, a clause. A single line of legal language buried in a streaming contract. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't an interview. It wasn't even a scene. It was an agreement, a decision, made long before the public ever saw a single frame. A decision that many now believe shattered Queen Elizabeth's heart in a way no scandal ever had. Let's go back. The deal between Netflix and the Duke and Duchess of Sussex was announced in September 2020. A multi-year agreement, worth upwards of $100 million. It was framed as a groundbreaking venture into inspirational storytelling. The buzzwords were all there. Diverse voices, shared humanity, empowering storytelling. But the subtext? Unmistakable. The royals were going Hollywood. And for a while, the palace said nothing. Publicly, at least. But behind the scenes, senior aides were panicking. Because Harry and Meghan had walked away from official duties, yes, but they hadn't relinquished their titles. They were still the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Still royal. And now, they were using that brand to ink deals with the biggest entertainment company on earth. At first, the Queen remained silent. She believed in restraint. She believed in loyalty. And, truthfully, she still believed Harry would come home. But then, the script started circulating. Early pitches, treatment documents, a leak here, a whisper there. And among them was something that changed everything. A clause. It appeared in a draft of Meghan's contract for the docuseries that would later be known simply as Harry and Meghan. The clause was short, just 2 lines. But its implications? Massive. The producers shall retain exclusive creative control. Subjects shall not be entitled to editorial veto over final cut. Translated? Meghan and Harry agreed not to interfere with the way they would be portrayed. But more importantly, they gave Netflix the power to decide how the royal family would be portrayed. And here's the kicker. Palace aides believe that Meghan not only signed off on the clause, she insisted on it. According to one insider familiar with the early negotiations, Meghan wanted the freedom to say everything, without the risk of being overruled later. She didn't want to shoot for weeks only to have the palace pull the plug. That clause guaranteed it would all come out. Let that sink in. The Queen, who had spent 7 decades fiercely guarding the privacy and dignity of the crown, was now the subject of a series that she had no say in. A series where she might be criticized, implied to be cold, complicit, even harmful, and she would have to watch it, just like the rest of us. One source close to Windsor's legal team said, that clause. It was like handing the crown over to Hollywood with a polite little bow. Now you might ask, why didn't the Queen intervene? Why not block the series? Sue. Pressure the government? Leverage the press? Because, simply put, she couldn't. Not without creating a bigger firestorm. If the monarchy appeared to be censoring a story about race, trauma, and family division, the blowback would be catastrophic. And so, the Queen did what she always did. She stayed silent. But it wasn't calm silence. It was heartbreak. According to a longtime courtier, when the Queen was shown the clause by her private secretary, weeks before the first teaser was released, she said just one thing. So, this is how they will tell our story. Not a story. Our story. That one word, our, said everything. Because Elizabeth didn't just see herself as the head of state. She saw herself as the living memory of a family. A legacy. A lineage going back 1,000 years. And now, That legacy was being sold to the highest bidder, with no way to defend itself. A former royal PR strategist put it bluntly. The Sussexes didn't just leave the firm. They franchised it, and they licensed it to Netflix. But what about Harry? Did he know what the clause meant? Did he realize how it would be received back home? Accounts vary. Some say he was unaware, focused more on the emotional tone of the series than the legal fine print. Others say he was fully informed, but too eager to have his side told. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. The Queen reportedly watched parts of the first rough cut in her private drawing room at Windsor. And when it ended, she reportedly asked for the room to be cleared. Alone, she sat for over an hour. No meetings, no aides, no corgis, just silence. One of her dressers later shared that the Queen whispered a line from Shakespeare, one she had quoted decades earlier during a state crisis. "Et tu, brute? And you, Harry? You too?" Now here's where the story turns cruel. Because just days after the Queen saw that clause and began processing what was about to unfold, a private letter arrived. From Meghan. Sources say it was cordial, respectful. She thanked the Queen for her service, mentioned Lilibet, said she hoped the docuseries would shed light, not cast blame. But to the Queen, it was a warning, not a comfort. A soft pre-apology wrapped in polite language, one that made it clear there would be no turning back. And Charles? He was livid, not just at Harry or Meghan, but at himself, because he realized what the Queen had always known. This wasn't just about media. It was about power, narrative control. The battle wasn't being fought in the press anymore. It was being fought on platforms. Global, permanent, unchecked. And the monarchy was losing. So Charles made a decision. There would be no more silence, no more waiting, no more hope for reconciliation. This clause, this series, this strategy, it was the final straw. And just as Harry and Meghan were preparing their global media rollout, Charles was preparing his own campaign, one that wouldn't be flashy or loud, but surgical, brutal, and permanent. Because if they were going to tell their truth, so would he, but not through interviews or trailers, through action. And the first target? Harry's royal identity itself. But before we get to that, you need to understand what came next. A moment that should have been a rare reunion, a symbolic gesture of unity. Instead, it became a masterclass in palace revenge. Because at the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, the final time the world saw her standing on that historic Buckingham Palace balcony, the Sussexes were there. But not really. And what happened behind the scenes at that event would haunt Harry forever. What if the most powerful man in the monarchy wasn't the king, but the ghost of a queen who left behind one final command? What if a single sheet of handwritten paper, hidden away in a drawer at Balmoral Castle, carried enough emotional weight to justify a royal purge? And what if that paper wasn't meant to be found until after her death? Let's talk about the letter. The letter that palace aides now refer to only in whispers. The one that wasn't in the official archive. Wasn't meant for biographers. Wasn't supposed to be seen by anyone except one man, Charles. Now, to understand the impact of this letter, you need to understand where it was found and why that matters. Let's go to Balmoral, the Queen's beloved retreat in Scotland. Not just a royal estate, but her sanctuary, her hideaway, the place where Elizabeth Windsor, not the crown, could breathe. It was here that she spent the last quiet weeks of her life. And it was here, shortly after her death, that palace staff began the somber process of sorting her personal belongings. Among the corgi photos, tartan shawls, and stacks of private correspondence, a desk drawer was found locked. Not unusual. The Queen was known for her love of order and secrets. But what was unusual was what happened next. That drawer wasn't opened by a staffer. It was opened by Charles. He had flown to Balmoral within hours of her passing. Not for ceremony. Not even for mourning. But for closure. And according to multiple insiders, it was during that first night, alone, with only a single footman on duty, that he unlocked the drawer. And there it was. A small envelope. Cream-colored. Slightly yellowed at the edges. On the front, in her unmistakable handwriting, just 2 words. To Charles. Nothing else. No seal. No date. Just a private letter from mother to son. He opened it. And whatever he read inside, it changed him. Because sources say that when he emerged from that room hours later, he was pale, cold, and silent. He didn't speak to Camilla. He didn't brief his advisors. He walked outside, stood under the black Scottish sky, and stared out at the hills. The next morning, the war began. But what did the letters say? Officially, we're not supposed to know. But in the months since that night, fragments have leaked. Not in headlines, not in tabloids, but through carefully placed whispers, passed along by those who served the Queen and watched Charles's transformation with growing unease. And those fragments? They tell a devastating story. According to